The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room fell completely silent as Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone in front of her. The freshman congresswoman from Texas sat straight, her burgundy suit crisp and flawless under the bright lights. Across the table, Senator Ted Cruz shuffled through his notes with the calm assurance of a man who rarely faced defeat in this chamber. What was about to happen, however, would become a moment no one present would ever forget. Before we continue, the cameras were already rolling, and the viewers at home were watching closely, because what followed would be one of those rare political moments when silence spoke louder than words. Ted Cruz completely speechless. The tension in the room was unmistakable. Cruz had already interrupted Crockett 5 times during her opening remarks on voting rights legislation, each time more dismissive than the last. Everyone sensed a 6th interruption was coming. But Crockett was ready. What had started as a routine committee hearing was about to become one of the most talked about exchanges of the year. Senator Cruz Crockett began her tone calm but unshakable. "I've counted your interruptions today 5 so far. Let's see if you make it to 7 before I finish explaining why your arguments aren't just wrong, but completely misinformed." A murmur rippled through the audience. Cameras pivoted to capture every angle. C-SPAN's live viewership spiked almost instantly. Cruz's trademark confidence began to falter, replaced by something few had ever seen from him: real discomfort. This wasn't just another committee session. This was the moment Jasmine Crockett, a first-term representative from Dallas, would do what few had managed before: challenge Ted Cruz on his own turf, using his own tactics in front of millions watching live. To understand the weight of what was unfolding, you had to know who these two people were. Jasmine Crockett's rise wasn't expected. Just 2 years earlier, she was a civil rights attorney in Dallas, taking on tough cases that big firms avoided defending clients who couldn't afford representation and confronting systemic injustice one case at a time. When she announced her run for Congress, the insiders laughed. A young black woman from Texas, they said, would never change Washington. But Crockett wasn't interested in following the rules of the old playbook. She intended to rewrite it. In her first months in office, she worked relentlessly, mastering every procedural rule and technical detail. While others gave speeches for the cameras, she spent long nights in the Library of Congress, poring over decades of debate transcripts. She understood that to reform the system, she had to know it better than those who built it. Ted Cruz, on the other hand, embodied the political establishment, a Princeton and Harvard law graduate. Former Solicitor General of Texas and long-serving Senator Cruz had built his reputation on sharp intellect and debate dominance. His signature move was the well-timed interruption used to rattle opponents, break their flow, and seize control of the narrative. For years, that technique had worked flawlessly. Against veteran lawmakers, cabinet officials, policy experts, no one had successfully countered it. But the confrontation that day wasn't just about the voting rights bill. It was about something deeper: power, who gets to speak and who gets silenced. The proposed legislation aimed to restore voting protections that had been stripped away over the past decade. For Cruz, opposing it meant maintaining his party's political advantage in Texas. For Crockett, it meant defending her constituents' right to be heard. People who waited hours in line just to cast a ballot. Beneath the surface, it was more than a policy debate. It was a struggle between the entrenched establishment and the new generation rising to challenge it. The hearing had been running for over 90 minutes. Cruz was in full command, cutting off witnesses, steering conversations, redirecting discussions. Party lines didn't matter. When Cruz spoke, the room went quiet. That was simply how things worked. Then came Representative Jasmine Crockett's turn. She was the last speaker of the day, and most assumed Cruz would relax. After all, both were Texans. Some courtesy was expected. But her poise unsettled him. She wasn't deferential. She skipped the usual small talk and began with confidence, as though her presence there was unquestionable. Cruz noticed. The first interruption came just 3 minutes in. Crockett was explaining the effects of polling site closures in Texas when Cruz cut her off sharply. "Representative Crockett, surely you're not suggesting senator?" She interrupted politely, but firmly. "I'm in the middle of presenting data. I'll take your questions when I'm done." Her tone was courteous, yet steady. Heads turned. It was rare for anyone to push back against Cruz's first interruption. He smiled his practiced, dismissive smile, part amusement, part condescension. He leaned back in his chair, pretending patience, but his tapping fingers gave him away. 2 minutes later came interruption number 2. Crockett was showing a map of polling site closures when Cruz leaned forward again. "This data is misleading," Senator Cruz Crockett interjected smoothly. "You'll have a full opportunity to respond. For now, I'm presenting verified evidence that deserves to be heard in full." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't glance up. Her composure was disarming. The air in the room shifted. Staffers stopped checking their phones. Senators leaned forward. Something different was happening. Cruz's interruptions were typically routine, almost expected, but no one ever called them out. The third interruption was sharper. "This is absolutely ridiculous. You can't just present one-sided, Senator Cruz," Crockett said evenly, meeting his eyes. "That's 3. The room fell silent. She'd said it aloud, something no one had ever dared to say to him in public. It seemed like a small act, but it shifted everything. She had made his behavior visible, undeniable, and counted in real time. "I'm simply trying to ensure accuracy," Cruz replied stiffly. "That's 4, Crockett said calmly, without missing a beat. The tension thickened. Committee Chair Dick Durbin hesitated, unsure whether to step in. But Crockett hadn't broken any rules. She was calm, factual, and composed. Yet everyone could feel the power in the room tilting. The 5th interruption came in a more controlled tone. Representative Crockett Cruz said, lowering his voice. "I think we'd all appreciate it if you could clarify 5, she said, marking her notes. "Senator Cruz, that's 5 interruptions in 10 minutes. Just wondering, is that a Senate record, or your personal best?" Laughter rippled through the chamber. Someone in the back even clapped before being quickly hushed. Cruz's face tightened. He was cornered to interrupt again and prove her point, or stay silent and lose control. But he couldn't help himself. As Crockett began citing voter testimonies, Cruz leaned toward his mic again. "These anecdotes don't represent." 6, Crockett said sharply, setting her papers aside. The room froze. "Senator Cruz," she said clearly, "you've now interrupted me 6 times. Before you reach 7, you should know I came prepared." She lifted a black folder and opened it deliberately. "I have here transcripts from the last 15 committee hearings you've attended. Would you like to know how often you interrupt female witnesses compared to male ones?" Cruz blinked but said nothing. "The ratio is 4 to 1. Crockett continued. "You interrupt women 4 times more than men, and black women 6 times more, especially black women from Texas." She paused just long enough. "So let's just say I'm not the first." The room buzzed. Staffers typed frantically. Someone whispered, "This is going viral." Cruz looked stunned. His confidence cracked as he opened his mouth, then closed it again. "That's an unfair characterization," he muttered. "Is it?" Crockett asked, flipping to another page. January 15th. You interrupted Professor Angela Davis 17 times in 30 minutes. February 3rd, Dr. Patricia Williams, 12 times. March 27th, Representative Nicole Collier, 21 times. Shall I continue? Cruz's face drained of color. His colleagues avoided eye contact. Senator John Kennedy stared into his coffee. Senator Josh Hawley looked up at the ceiling. This is an ambush, Cruz said finally. No, Senator Crockett replied calmly. An ambush is interrupting someone 6 times while they're presenting verified data. What I'm doing is called preparation. There's a difference. She turned back to her presentation. The room hummed with quiet tension. Cameras zoomed in on Cruz's face, flickering with frustration. Now, as I was saying before the 6th interruption, Crockett continued, her voice perfectly steady. The data clearly shows a consistent pattern of voter suppression, particularly in Houston County. Cruz could barely contain himself. His reputation had been built on dominance, but being counted and called out in real time shredded that image. His pride got the better of him. He leaned toward his microphone once more, sarcasm lacing his tone. Representative Crockett, your little performance might impress your Twitter followers, but 7. The single word echoed through the room. Crockett stood slowly, moving to the side of the table so everyone could see her. The silence was total. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Senator Cruz, she said firmly, you've now interrupted me 7 times. 7 times you've tried to cut me off. 7 times you've tried to stop the American people from hearing the truth about our state. She clicked a remote, and a video began playing on the screen behind her footage of Cruz at a recent event. The radical left, his recorded voice thundered, wants to silence conservative voices. They can't win on ideas, so they try to stop us from speaking. Crockett paused the video. Interesting philosophy, Senator, she said evenly. So, tell me, what exactly are you doing right now? The room remained still. Cruz sat frozen, caught between anger and disbelief. A moment later, described by photographers as the instant he realized he had lost control of the narrative. But Crockett wasn't done. You know what the real issue is? Senator, she continued, walking slowly down the table like a prosecutor before a jury. You've done this for so long, you don't even notice it anymore. The constant interruptions, talking over people, dismissing voices that don't sound like yours. It's become a reflex. She pressed the remote again. A montage appeared on the screen behind her, clips of Cruz interrupting witnesses over the years. Women, people of color, activists, seniors, one after another. His voice filled the room again and again. That's inaccurate. You're misunderstanding my point. Let me explain what you mean. That's just not true. The pattern was unmistakable. When the final clip ended, even some of Cruz's colleagues looked uneasy. Senator Susan Collins jotted something down in her notebook. Senator Mitt Romney covered his mouth, but his expression said everything. More than 143 interruptions. In 6 months, Crockett read aloud from her notes. That's 1 interruption every 12 minutes of testimony. But when Fortune 500 CEOs testify, it drops to once every 45 minutes. When oil executives appear once per hour. But when it's someone like me, it's every 3 minutes. Cruz finally spoke. This is character assassination. No, Senator Crockett replied evenly. It's mathematics. Numbers don't lie. They don't have political bias. They just show the truth. And the truth reveals a clear, undeniable pattern. She returned to her seat, but didn't sit. Instead, she opened a thick binder. Would you like to know what else my research found? Senator Cruz gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles pale. This is not what this hearing is about, he said sharply. Oh, but it is, Crockett interjected, her first interruption of the day. This hearing is about voting rights, about who gets heard and who gets silenced. And you, Senator Cruz, have just shown us exactly how that silencing happens. She opened the binder again. Let's review your voting record on election-related legislation. In 2019, you voted against the Voting Rights Advancement Act. In 2020, you opposed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. In 2021, you voted against the For the People Act. And during those hearings, you interrupted witnesses supporting those bills, an average of 8 times each. Those bills were examples of federal overreach, Cruz began. I'm not finished, Senator Crockett cut in, her tone sharp but controlled. I didn't come here to argue, I came here to present evidence. Evidence that you've repeatedly acted to make voting harder while talking over those who try to expose it. She unfolded a large map of Texas, its counties marked in red and blue. These are the areas where polling places were closed, she explained. Your campaign received donations from organizations that lobbied for those closures. Is that just a coincidence? Cruz pushed back from his chair, voice rising. I don't have to sit here and listen to these baseless claims. Then don't sit, Crockett shot back, unwavering. Stand and be accountable. Stand and tell the people of Texas why they have to wait 8 hours in line to vote. Stand and explain why their voices matter less than your donors. The chamber came alive. Staffers craned for a better view as C-SPAN cameras cut between Cruz and Crockett. Online, the phrase "number 7" was already trending. Drawing on years of debate experience, Cruz tried to reclaim control. Representative Crockett, he said, your performance today perfectly demonstrates what's wrong with politics. Instead of focusing on policy, you're chasing viral moments, grandstanding for social media, while serious legislators do the work. This is why freshman representatives should learn to what Senator Crockett interrupted smoothly. Learn to stay quiet, to accept being talked over, to know their place. She held up her phone. Do you know what this is? Senator, this is democracy in the 21st century. Right now, over 3 million people are watching this live, watching how you treat those who dare to disagree with you. 3 million voters are seeing in real time what you really think of their right to be heard. She set the phone down and lifted another document. This, she said, is a letter signed by every Democratic member of the Texas House of Representatives. Cruz said nothing. He was still standing, shoulders stiff, face flushed. His earlier confidence had drained away. This letter, Crockett continued, declares their unified support for federal voting rights legislation. They've seen what happens when those protections disappear. They're tired of watching their constituents be silenced. And finally, let me quote directly. We stand with Representative Crockett as she speaks truth to power, no matter how many times she's interrupted. Applause erupted across the chamber. It wasn't just Democrats. Staffers, reporters, even a few security officers joined in. The sound filled the room as Chairman Durbin pounded his gavel, struggling to restore order. Cruz leaned toward his microphone, shouting over the noise. This is a violation of committee rules. Chairman Durbin, I demand 8. Crockett interjected smoothly. Laughter swept through the room. Not cruel laughter, but the kind that comes when truth becomes undeniable. Cruz froze, speechless. After a long pause, he gathered his papers, turned, and walked out. The heavy wooden door slammed behind him, echoing through the chamber. Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. Everyone knew they had just witnessed a historic moment. Crockett waited for the room to settle. Mr. Chairman, she said, her tone returning to professional calm. I'd like to continue my presentation on voting rights. Without interruption, it should take about 10 minutes. Durbin, still visibly stunned, nodded. The witness may proceed. Before she could resume, Senator Elizabeth Warren began a slow, deliberate clap from the back of the room. One by one, Others joined Democrats, independents, even a few Republicans. Something had shifted. When the applause faded, Crockett continued her testimony. For 10 uninterrupted minutes, she presented her findings clearly, concisely, with quiet authority. Not one person spoke over her. When she finished, she gathered her notes and walked toward the exit. Before leaving, she turned back with a faint smile. "Oh, and Senator Cruz's interruption count today," she said. "It's actually below his average. Last year, he interrupted Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee 14 times in 20 minutes. So, technically, this was progress." Laughter rippled again through the chamber as she exited, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Behind her, the committee buzzed with energy, the air electric with what had just unfolded. Within an hour, the moment exploded across social media. C-SPAN's hearing feed became the most viewed broadcast in its history. Hashtags like #7interruptions and Crockett v. Cruz trended worldwide. News outlets called it the 7 interruptions heard around the world. Political commentators described it as one of the most devastating dismantlings of a senior senator ever captured on camera. But the real success wasn't the takedown. It was what came after. Crockett's data, her research, her arguments about voter suppression dominated national headlines. The conversation shifted away from personalities and back to the issue itself. Cruz tried damage control, issuing a statement accusing Crockett of staging a viral stunt instead of focusing on policy. But that statement was quickly overshadowed by resurfaced footage clips of him interrupting female witnesses in past hearings. A viral compilation titled "Ted Cruz Interrupts Women for 10 Minutes Straight" hit 50 million views in a single day. Even some Republican colleagues began quietly distancing themselves. Senator John Cornyn told reporters, "Everyone deserves to be heard in committee hearings without unnecessary interruptions." Senator Lisa Murkowski was more direct. "What we saw today was long overdue." But perhaps the most surprising response came from former Republican Senator Bob Corker, who tweeted, "I served with Ted Cruz for 6 years. What Representative Crockett did today is something many of us wanted to do, but never had the courage to. Bravo." Crockett's victory was undeniable, yet she refused to make it personal. In every interview, she redirected the spotlight back to the issue voting rights. Speaking with CNN's Jake Tapper, she said, "This isn't about me versus anyone. It's about protecting every American's right to be heard. If this helped people pay attention to that, then it was worth it." The fallout from what became known as the 7 interruptions hearing spread rapidly through American politics. Within 24 hours, it had transcended politics, entirely entering pop culture. The number 7 became a meme. People started using it in meetings, classrooms, and casual conversations whenever someone interrupted. That's 1, that's 2, and so on. Saturday Night Live aired a sketch about it. Stephen Colbert devoted an entire monologue to the exchange, but the most significant change happened inside Congress itself. The very next day, during a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, Senator Rand Paul began to interrupt a witness, then paused. "I'm sorry," he said. "Please continue." Across Washington, something had shifted. Witnesses were treated differently. Committee hearings grew quieter, more respectful. No one wanted to be the next Ted Cruz. Representative Jasmine Crockett quickly became a national figure, but not in the shallow, celebrity-driven way politics sometimes rewards. She didn't chase attention. She used it. Every media appearance, every interview, every late-night show invitation became an opportunity to redirect the conversation back to voting rights. On The Daily Show, when asked about her confrontation with Cruz, She used the moment to highlight a map of closed polling locations. On the view, she brought 5 voters from Texas who had been disenfranchised. The numbers told the story better than any headline. C-SPAN, which usually drew around 300,000 viewers for congressional hearings, saw more than 1 million views across platforms for Crockett's exchange with Cruz. Google searches for voting rights legislation surged by over 3,000%. Across the country, more than 100 town halls on voting access were organized in the weeks that followed. Young Americans who had never watched a congressional hearing before were suddenly quoting parliamentary rules and debating committee procedure. Meanwhile, Ted Cruz found himself facing something he wasn't accustomed to: real consequences. Even Republicans began to keep their distance. At a closed-door GOP caucus meeting, Cruz attempted to defend his behavior. But according to one senator, the room went Arctic cold. Senator John Kennedy summed it up bluntly: "When you're in a hole, stop digging." Cruz brought an excavator. Corporate donors noticed the shift too. 3 major Texas companies that had supported him announced they were reevaluating their political contributions. A petroleum company CEO speaking anonymously to the Wall Street Journal said, "We donate to politicians who effectively represent our interests." Getting dismantled by a freshman congresswoman on national television doesn't qualify as effective. But the biggest impact came from inside Texas. 3 days after the hearing, a statewide poll showed Cruz's approval rating had dropped 12 points. Even more striking, 67% of Republicans in Texas said they were embarrassed by his behavior. At a town hall in Houston, when Cruz interrupted a constituent asking about health care, someone in the audience shouted, "That's one." The room erupted in laughter, and Cruz ended the event early. Meanwhile, the Texas Democratic Party recorded record volunteer sign-ups and donations. Beto O'Rourke, who had narrowly lost to Cruz in 2018, tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett did in 18 minutes what I couldn't do in 18 months, show Texas who Ted Cruz really is." Even among Republicans, reflection began to surface. Senator Marco Rubio told Politico, "We need to be better about letting people speak, especially when we disagree. The optics of interrupting women and minorities are terrible and flat out wrong." Soon after, the Senate Rules Committee held an emergency session to discuss limits on interruptions during testimony. Senator Amy Klobuchar introduced what quickly became known as the Crockett Rule. Witnesses must be allowed to finish their opening statements without interruption. The rule passed unanimously. Cruz voted in favor, though he didn't attend in person. 2 weeks later, momentum returned to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which had been stalled for months. 3 Republican senators announced support for a revised version, including Lisa Murkowski, who cited Crockett directly. Representative Crockett's presentation made clear that we need a serious discussion about voting access, not political theater. Crockett stayed focused. She declined most interview requests and spent her time building bipartisan coalitions in Congress. She met quietly with Republican representatives from Texas, finding common ground on issues like infrastructure and veteran support. "I didn't come to Washington to go viral," she told her staff. "I came here to get things done." But the ripple effects of the confrontation were felt far beyond Congress. In corporate America, women began pushing back against constant interruptions in meetings. Harvard Business Review published an article titled "The Crockett Effect: How Counting Changes Conversations," noting a 40% drop in interruptions in workplaces where employees had discussed the hearing. Universities incorporated the moment into courses on political communication, gender dynamics, and leadership. A Georgetown professor called Crockett's performance a masterclass in preparation meeting opportunity, analyzing her tone, timing, and strategy for hours. Even globally, the moment resonated. The BBC aired a segment comparing great political takedowns, while a British MP tweeted that she was taking notes from Crockett's approach, calling it American political theater at its sharpest. 3 months later, when the updated voting rights bill came to a vote, something unexpected happened. Ted Cruz abstained. He didn't vote for it, but he didn't vote against it either. Reportedly, he wanted to avoid another public clash with Jasmine Crockett, who was scheduled to testify that week. The bill passed by 2 votes. At the signing ceremony, President Biden invited Crockett to stand beside him. As he signed the bill, he leaned over and whispered, "Evan, interruptions, huh? I've been in the Senate for decades and never saw anything like that." Crockett smiled. For her, it wasn't about a victory over Cruz. It was about millions of Americans gaining fairer access to the ballot box. Still, she allowed herself one quiet moment of satisfaction. Later, a reporter asked Representative Crockett any message for Senator Cruz. She paused, then said with a small grin, "I hope he's learned that every voice deserves to be heard." "Do you think he has the reporter pressed?" Crockett replied. "He's been pretty quiet lately. That's a start." The confrontation left an enduring impact. Political science textbooks included the exchange as a case study in communication strategy. A documentary team followed Crockett for a year, creating an Emmy-winning film about her rise. Cruz, for his part, attempted image rehabilitation. He went on a listening tour in Texas, avoided interrupting during hearings, and hired a new communications team. At a political dinner, he even joked, "I learned to count to 7 the hard way." Still, in every hearing afterward, someone, staff, spectator, or senator, was counting under their breath. A year later, at the Washington Press Club dinner, Crockett received the Political Moment of the Year award. In her acceptance speech, she said, "People ask if I planned it. I prepared. But you can't script authenticity. You can only be ready when the moment arrives. Senator Cruz gave me a chance to show what millions experience every day, being silenced, talked over, dismissed." She paused. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is count. Count the interruptions. Count the votes. Count the hours people wait to cast a ballot. Make the invisible visible. That's how change happens, one number at a time." The audience applauded. Even some Republicans stood. Cruz wasn't there. His absence spoke for itself. As Crockett was leaving the stage, a young intern approached her. "Representative Crockett," she said shyly, "thank you. I get interrupted all the time in meetings. Now I count. Knowing the number gives me power." Crockett smiled warmly. "That's the thing about counting," she said. "Anyone can do it. You just have to pay attention and refuse to be silenced." The ripple effect continued. Political scientists released an interruption index measuring how often lawmakers talked over witnesses by gender, race, and age. The findings prompted new reforms. In Texas, voter registration rose 23% in counties most affected by polling closures. Young candidates inspired by Crockett ran under the slogan, "Every voice counts." The Texas Tribune launched a long-form series titled After 7, documenting how political culture in the state had shifted since the confrontation. Eventually, Cruz announced he would not seek re-election, citing new opportunities. But insiders knew his political influence had faded. Yet the true legacy of the 7 interruptions wasn't Cruz's decline. It was the cultural transformation. Hearings became more respectful. Witnesses were allowed to speak. "Let them finish" became a bipartisan refrain. 5 years later, Jasmine Crockett stood on the steps of the Capitol to be sworn in as a U.S. Senator from Texas, defeating Cruz's chosen successor by 15 points. Reflecting on her path, she told the New York Times, "I never planned to become the interruption counter." But sometimes history chooses your role. Ted Cruz thought he was putting me in my place. Instead, he gave me a platform. When asked if she ever spoke to Cruz again, she laughed. He called about a year later to clear the air. I let him talk for 5 minutes. Then I said, "Senator, I need to interrupt you." There was silence. Then Cruz said, "I deserve that." Cruz later taught a course on civil discourse and politics. When Senator Jasmine Crockett entered the Senate chamber for her first vote, she carried the same folder from that famous hearing, filled with transcripts and data she no longer needed, but kept as a reminder. Preparation, she believed, wasn't just about winning arguments. It was about shifting the rules so that everyone had the chance to be heard. The 7 interruptions became more than a viral moment. They marked a turning point in American politics, a lesson that real power doesn't belong to the loudest voice, but to the one that refuses to be silenced. Jasmine Crockett didn't just outmaneuver Ted Cruz. She redefined how voices could rise in the halls of power. Her message endures. Count the interruptions, make them visible, and never let anyone silence your voice.